Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm so happy that you're here today to talk with me about flat design. So welcome to the fundamental flaw in flat design. Try to say that 5 times fast. So I know we just had a lovely little intro for me, but before we get started, I want to give a little bit more background about who I am and what I do at Nielsen Norman Group. So Nielsen Norman Group, or as we call it, NNG. If you're not familiar with the work that we do, we are a UX research-focused consultancy, and we're led by Jacob Nielsen, Don Norman, and Bruce Tognazzini. And my role is UX specialist, but I know that that title is pretty vague. So I just want to quickly let you know about some of the roles that I hold at NNG. So the first primary role is as a UX educator. So I train professionals on a variety of UX-related topics in full-day courses. So my typical format for talking is about 8 hours. So you can imagine how difficult it was for me to condense myself into 45 minutes here. And then my second primary role is as a UX researcher. So I conduct UX research using a variety of methodologies. Some of the research that I do is for clients, so that will be like focused specifically on one product. But in addition to that, we have a lot of independently funded research projects that we do. So for example, this photo was taken earlier this year when we were studying the information-seeking behaviors and content needs for oceanographer researchers. So when we're doing these kinds of independent research, what we're really looking at are sort of larger themes, trends, emerging topics that affect the field of UX and UI design as a whole. So that's where a lot of the findings that I'm going to be sharing with you today are coming from. Now, before we dive in, I want to set up a few short definitions. Flat design, everybody kind of has a little bit of a different way that they define it or what they think of when they think of the phrase flat design. So I like to define it as what it isn't. So a flat design is an aesthetic style that's defined by the absence of glossy or 3D or raised or layered effects. And designers and researchers tend to consider this as a reaction against the trends of skeuomorphism and also realism. So if you're not familiar with skeuomorphism, as it applies to design, skeuomorphism means taking a digital interface and making it resemble some real world or physical precedent. So the goal of skeuomorphism is often to communicate something about how to use the digital product. So I have 2 examples here for skeuomorphism. Maybe kind of hard to see because the contrast is pretty high there. The first one on the left is the original operating system for Amazon's Kindle Fire. And it may be kind of tough to see, but there are some wood effects in the background there. And the interface is designed to look like a physical bookshelf. So you can imagine that from the designer's perspective, maybe they were trying to communicate something to their users about what this view is intended to be, like a bookshelf or a DVD case, somewhere where you're going to be storing your media, your ebooks, your movies, or your e-magazines. Now, does it actually have to be designed this way? No, of course not. We could use any variety of styles to present this to our users. And on the right here, we have another example of skeuomorphism, which is an early iOS calculator. So we have some raised buttons there, and you'll notice that this layout looks pretty familiar. It looks like a traditional real-world physical calculator. Now, when we're designing digital products, we have essentially limitless space, right? We don't have to confine this to a single screenful. So why would the designers do this? Well, to communicate to users so that when they see this, they think, okay, so I've seen a real-world calculator before. That's what this looks like, so I know how to use it. So in a lot of ways, skeuomorphism, which we saw in the late 90s, the early 2000s, was kind of hand-holding, trying to help people understand how to use these new digital interfaces. Now, flat is kind of a reaction against that, moving as far away from this as we can. And in 2011, with the release of Windows 8, this really started to crystallize flat design as being a separate aesthetic and kind of bring it to be more mainstream. So pulling us as far away from those skeuomorphic, those realistic designs as we can go. So this is a quote from an article that was published when Windows 8 was first released. This is by Steve Clayton, the chief digital storyteller at Microsoft, which I think is an awesome title. It makes me want to change my title, something cooler. So what this says is being authentically digital is about going beyond the rules and properties of the physical world to create new and exciting possibilities in a purely digital realm, which just sounds like poetry, right? So this kind of captures, I think, a lot of the sentiment behind flat design and a lot of the excitement. So at the time that Steve Clayton was writing this, it's 2011. Our users are more sophisticated. This isn't the first time they've seen a digital interface. We don't have to make everything look like a real-world precedent in order for people to understand how to use it. So I think in particular, this phrase, authentically digital, is a strong expression of that feeling. We're free to make these digital interfaces into anything, and we don't have to be limited by the rules of the real world. And since then, flat has just exploded. It's everywhere. So if you visited a digital agency's website or a designer's portfolio website recently, or in the past 5 years, I'm willing to bet that it was flat. Anybody who wants a pre-made website from a one-stop shop hosting service like Squarespace is probably going to have to use a flat template. And Apple was actually slower than some large tech companies to adopt flat design. They still had skeuomorphic effects on their website until as late as 2012. But as you can see now, their current site is ultra flat. And then even kind of massive, old, traditionally slow-moving companies like IBM have gone to flat. And when flat design first appeared on the scene, there was a little bit of speculation, maybe this is just a trend, it's limited to the web. But that's not really true anymore. We've seen flat permeate our society even into things like logos. And you'll notice one of these three companies is not like the others, right? So it's not just Google and Netflix who are flattening their UIs, flattening their logos, but also companies like Olive Garden. So this is really a shift in visual tastes. And we see this shift everywhere. And so flat has this feeling of being what we consider now to be modern or updated or hip. So at this point, you may be thinking, what's your deal, Kate? What's your problem with flat design? This all sounds pretty great, right? It's authentically digital. We're free to do this. But to explain the problem that I've been observing in our usability research with flat design, I'm going to have to set up another definition. So signifiers. In digital interfaces, signifiers are the things that tell people what they can do with your product. They're the visual, perceptible clues that let them know what actions are available in an interface. So there are links and buttons that can be tapped or clicked. There are menus that can be opened, things that can be dragged and dropped. Your signifiers are the ways that you communicate to your users that they can do these things, that they can take these actions. So if we return to that skeuomorphic iOS calculator, you can see with these buttons, the reason that they look raised, the reason why they look 3D, is to give the impression that they can be pushed down, that they can be tapped or clicked. So that's a very strong traditional signifier. So here's the problem. When designers are taking out those kind of heavy-handed, ugly shadows, those glossy buttons, these 3D effects, they're making the interfaces more visually appealing. They're reducing some of the information overload. But additionally, they're often also removing the signifiers, those perceptible clues that people relied upon to know what they could do in an interface. So it turns out that when you flatten your UI and you're removing those signifiers, you're also starting to blur the lines between what's interactive and non-interactive in the minds of your users. And it's making it harder for people to understand what actions are available to them within any given interface. So another definition here that's emerged as a result of some of the trends that we see with flat design is a weak signifier. So many sites have been leaving signifiers out altogether when they go to this ultra-flat aesthetic, or they've been using what we're calling these weak signifiers. So this is something that looks like or vaguely resembles a traditional signifier, but is a little bit subtler, a little less noticeable. And so again, partially that's why these interfaces might look a little bit better, look a little bit cleaner or easier to take in, because these are subtler clues. But that also means that they're not as noticeable or quickly recognizable by users. So this is a model of how users used to figure out whether or not they could interact with something on the web or in a digital product. So they would see strong signifiers, so things like those glossy raised buttons in that calculator application, or they'd see underlined blue text, those really traditional visual communication of links, and they could safely assume that those things were interactive. They were clickable, they were tappable. But then they'd see elements without strong signifiers, so static text or headings with no additional visual treatment to them. And they could generally assume that those things were probably not interactive. They were probably not clickable. But after the rise in popularity of flat design, this is what users have to consider. In some situations, they're encountering interfaces that have elements that are styled with weak signifiers or no signifiers that do turn out to be interactive. And in some cases, it's the only path for these users to get to the thing, the information, the functionality that they need. So they're having these experiences on websites, and it's shifting the way that they look for these interaction clues. So we wanted to investigate some of the ways that these weak or absent signifiers might be impacting users. So we conducted an experiment where we took 9 different web pages, and we created 2 different versions of each web page. So one version had very strong traditional signifiers, and the other version had very weak flat signifiers. So what we have here is an example of one of the pages that we used. It's a close-up of the top left corner so that you can see some of the differences here. On the left is the strong signifier version, and on the right is the weak signifier version. So we conducted a between-subject study where we took 70 users, and each user saw only one version of each of these pages. And they were given what I would call a little task fragment. So it wasn't a full task like you would typically have in a usability study. Essentially, they were just asked to find something on the page. So for this example, the Hertz example, we asked users, we said, imagine that you reserved a rental car. You're going to see the rental company's website, cancel the reservation. So we would have people identify where they would go. So in this example, the target was the cancel the reservation tab, which is deactivated in the top left corner there. And while these participants did these tasks, we tracked their eyes using eye tracking software. If you're not familiar with how eye tracking software works, essentially it's just special equipment. Every time you take a user in for the test, a participant in, you have to calibrate the machine to their specific eyes and their eye movements. And then this equipment can track where the user's eyes are moving across the page and produce visualizations that show you what they looked at in the interface. So one of those kinds of visualizations that you can get from eye tracking research is a heat map. So this is an example heat map. So this shows where many users, usually around 30, looked on a page. So the red that you see here, that's where people looked the most and the longest. So we call where people look on these pages fixations. So the red areas have the most and the longest fixations. And then the purple is where people looked the least and the shortest amount of time. So, and then the areas where there's no color overlay, people didn't look there. And so when we were analyzing our results from this study, we looked at those visualizations that were produced as well as some metrics for the gaze data. And we found that people spent more time looking at the weak signifier pages, those flat pages, and they had to look at more elements on the page. They had to look around the page more while they were trying to do these tasks. So one thing I want to point out here, it's important to note that in this case, more time and more fixations on the pages was not a good thing. Because remember, these were findability tasks. So we can't look at this data and say, okay, well, that means that people were more engaged or they liked the flat signifierless versions more. Because in this case, they were looking to find something. So this means that they had to put in roughly a fourth more effort, more time in order to locate those things. And so then when we compared the eye tracking heat maps, we started to see a pattern. So this is the full page versions of the Hertz example that I showed you just a couple slides ago. Again, we have the strong signifier version on the left and the weak on the right. And what we started to see was that for 6 out of the 9 pairs that we tested, we saw differences in the heat maps. The heat maps were not the same when we compared them. And for the remaining 3, the 3 where they actually had identical heat maps, we have some theories about why that might be, why we didn't see a difference in the effects there. And I'll talk about that in our last section today. So in the 6 where we did see differences, we saw that the weak signifier versions had more and broader outspread fixations. So especially when you look at the red areas comparing these two, you can see that in the weak version, the red areas are larger and they're located in more places on the page. And especially noticeable in this example is if you look down at the bottom of the page, you can see there's a lot more red on the footer. Now, the reason why that is problematic is usually in our research, when we see that people start looking at the footers of pages, that means they're starting to get desperate. They're not really seeing what they're expecting to see, or they're not confident in that what they're looking for is on the page. So this is another example. So this is a close-up of a landing page from a fine jewelry store's website. And we asked participants in this example to locate the pearl jewelry that was sold on this website. So this is a close-up of the intended target here. So we were hoping that they would locate this link at the bottom. So you can see on the left is the strong traditional signifier version, and on the right is the weak signifier version. So on the left, we have a very traditional underlined blue link. And on the right, the text is styled exactly the same as static text, which is something that unfortunately we see on a lot of ultra-flat websites, where the intention of the users or of the designers is that the users will recognize the link based on its placement and the language used in the link. So that's what we were trying to see. Okay, so we have these two very different versions of the same page. How are users going to respond to this? So this is the heat map. These are the heat maps for both of those versions. So on the left is the strong signifier heat map, and on the right is the weak signifier heat map. And on the left, we can see that most of the red areas are focused around that pearl heading, so the subheading there, the 3 years pearl heading, and also the link underneath, the link that we were intending that they would find on the page. And when we watched the individual replays of the sessions, that's where users were looking. So they would first notice that subheading, and then they would move down to the intended target link. And actually, we saw that 86% of the participants who were exposed to the strong version followed that pattern. So first the subheading, and then the link. In the weak version, only 50% of participants who saw the weak version followed that same pattern. And what we started to see in the weak version was instead, people would see the subheading, they'd fixate on that, and then they would identify that as the target. They never even looked at, many of them never even looked at the shop pearl link that we wanted them to find. So we can see that difference in the heat map here. There's so much more red area focused around that subheading and very little on the shop pearl link. So I'm going to show you one of the gaze replays for one user who saw the weak signifier version for this page. So first I'm going to play this in real time. So sometimes it's a little jarring if you've never seen a replay of someone's eye moving across the page, but that really is how fast and kind of chaotic it looks. When we're doing these tests, we have to be really careful that we angle our monitor that we're looking at with their actual gaze away from our participants, because if they see this, they're like, is there something wrong with me? Is that really my eyes? So what I'm going to do is slow this down now. We're going to watch this in half time. And when you slow down gaze replays, you can see that they're actually pretty strategic. So first, she's taking in the page, looking at the main navigation, seeing what's available. She's not seeing what she wants at the top, so she scrolls down. She sees the pearl image and then the subheading. So I've muted this clip, but when she looks at the subheading, she announces, oh, I found the link. I found what I'm looking for. And so then we stop the task. So her gaze never even gets down to the bottom. She never sees the target link. Now, if this was a real-life task, and this was really the pattern that someone was going through while they were trying to find pearl jewelry from this page, As long as that subheading is linked, it's fine, right? She's going to find what she's looking for. So the problem isn't that people can't use flat designs. They can, except in maybe some of the worst cases, the poorest designed flat designs. People can generally figure out what they want. The problem is that these weak signifiers that are so common in flat designs, they're less noticeable. They aren't attracting as much attention, and they're contributing to click uncertainty. Now, click uncertainty, it's a psychological state when people aren't sure where they can go in an interface. How are they going to move forward to accomplish their goals? It's kind of a feeling of a lack of empowerment. So we've observed the impact of this phenomenon in user behavior during our qualitative research as well as our quantitative studies. Specifically, when there are weak or absent clickability clues, that tends to result in 3 different primary interaction strategies that we're seeing become more common. So first, people are more likely now to hover or experiment, just kind of make a guess, and click on things to figure out where they can go in an interface. So they're not able to just look at an interface and know at a glance what actions are available to them, so they have to do a little bit of experimentation. They're also more dependent on feedback. So if I'm about to click on something and I don't know that it's going to take me where I want it to go, then after I click or I tap it, I need immediate feedback. If I'm in a mobile application and there's a lag and I don't know that anything is happening, I don't know, is my mobile network slow? Is the application broken? Or did I click on or tap on the wrong thing because I'm really not certain that this is meant to be interactive? And then finally, they're also more dependent on context clues. So when I say context clues, I mean placement on the page, what else is around the element, maybe what label text is used for the element to help people figure out whether or not they can click or tap on these things. So we've also heard some of the allusions to these behaviors in the users' comments themselves. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you 3 comments that come from different usability studies. So in these studies, I would see a user while they're trying to accomplish a task, see something that was very flat or had absent signifiers, and they would click or tap it. And then I would ask them once they were done with the task, I saw that you clicked this, I saw that you tapped this. How did you know that this was going to take you where you wanted to go? How did you know that this was going to be clickable? And so this is what I've heard from users. And so I'm going to show you 3 quotes from 3 individuals, but the reasons why I picked these is because they're good examples of the themes that we keep hearing from users. So here's our first one. So this user says, by scrolling over it, then you know, some stuff you assume, but it's nice when links are bolded and you can tell. It's hard when you think something's a link and it's not, and you have to figure out how to get it another way. So when this user says scrolling over it, what he means is he's doing that experimental hovering. He's looking for his cursor to turn into a pointer so he knows that he can click on that element, which is unfortunate. He shouldn't have to rely on that as his only indication that it's something that's interactive. And then we hear a little bit of the frustration. It's hard when you think that something's a link and it turns out it's not. It's disappointing when I think this is going to take me to where I want to go, but it doesn't, and I have to figure out how to find that some other way. So here's our second one. This user said, when it's blue and underlined, that's how you know initially. You see that even in Word and stuff. But really, especially when it's underlined, that helps. Or if it's a button, it doesn't have to say click here, but if it says buy now or purchase or add to cart. So this user, when she says when it's blue and underlined, she's talking about that really traditional, like early web 90s underlined blue links, the standard that's been around for a long time. So first she's looking for those really strong traditional signifiers, those clues that she can click on this. She sees that even in Word and stuff. So it's not just a standard on the web, it's a long-standing standard that she's come to rely on and recognize. But then she says, it doesn't have to be blue. It can be underlined, as long as that's kind of getting towards the weaker signifiers, so the derivative forms of these traditional signifiers. But she can still recognize that, realize that it's meant to be clicked. Or if it's a button, it doesn't have to say click here, but if it says buy now. So that's where she's looking at those context clues. She's looking for some indication based on the context to tell her that she can tap this thing or click it. And then finally, just like the others, I asked this user how she knew that she could click on a flat element, and she said, I don't. I just start clicking and praying that it works. Now that's a big problem, right? These are not the kind of experiences that we want to be creating. When we're working on these digital products, we want people to feel empowered. We want them to know what actions are available to them. And this is one of the biggest problems, is that this lack of signifiers really creates this feeling of powerlessness for users. And now here's the kicker. So it doesn't even matter if your product doesn't use flat design, or it does, and you do it responsibly, and you've really thought out the interaction design, and you know that you're not damaging your user's experience. Even if you're doing everything right, there's still a lot of websites and products out there that aren't. And when users are coming to your site, when they're coming to your application, they're coming to your product, they're taking all of their previous experiences with other interfaces with them, and they're applying that to your product as they're trying to figure it out. So users are learning to be sort of uncertain and wary and a little bit uncomfortable, and they're bringing that mental model with them when they visit you. So there are definitely benefits to flat design. I really don't want you to leave here thinking, wow, Kate Meyer really hates flat design. I am definitely not advocating for a shift back to this, right? I mean, this is ugly. It was not like the value that it's providing. This doesn't really warrant the kind of information, the visual overload that we're getting here. So we don't need to go back to the heavy-handed skeuomorphic effects that we used to have. And flat design, ultra-flat design, really is a dramatic reaction to that. But we can have a balance here. We can have the lack of information overload. We can have these clean, modern visual designs without harming the interaction design, without making these things harder for our users to do. And so this is really the point here. Flat design can be awesome as long as you're really careful. So this is going to be our golden rule of implementing a flat design. Just don't break the interaction design, please. And you can avoid harming your interaction design in a few ways. So remember when I was talking about the eye tracking experiment, I said that 3 out of the 9 pairs that we compared didn't have differences in the heat maps. Well, they had some things in common, those interfaces did. And so that leads us to have theories about when flat design can work just as well as any other kind of design. And so we're going to cover some of these things now, things that you can do to make sure that if you want to have a flat design, you can do it without hurting your users. First, be consistent. Do not mix and match clickability clues. So for example, it's fine if you want to make your in-text links dark orange. Just don't also make your static headlines dark orange. Remember that users are looking for patterns. They're trying to learn how they can move through your interface. So don't send them mixed messages. It'll just confuse them. So for example, you would not want to use ghost buttons. So those, if you're not familiar with ghost buttons, just a line of text in a rectangle to communicate a button. You wouldn't want to use ghost buttons and put your headlines in rectangular boxes that look just like ghost buttons. So for example, it's hard to tell in this interface if that introduction, if that's going to be something that's linked or it's not. It's actually not. So this site gets a red X. That's not a good example of consistency. If you're going to go to full-on flat design, make sure that you're paying a lot of attention to the context clues in your interface, recognizing that people are going to be looking for these and relying on them more than they used to. So the easiest way to help users understand where the clickable elements are is to use a traditional layout for your page type. And sites that go ultra-flat and are still successful are the ones that tend to be relatively simple. And that's because if you have a lot of, say, white space and spacing around your flat elements, those elements become more salient. They become more noticeable. And so it kind of decreases the effect of their subtlety, which is good. So this is the homepage for the Kentucky Derby. And so this is from another eye tracking study that we did late last year. And there's a lot going on in this view. There's a lot going on in this homepage. It's flat, but it is not simple. And there isn't really a clear and easily understandable visual hierarchy going on here. So one of our users in the eye tracking study was looking to sign up for their newsletter. And she had a hard time on this page. So this is a gaze plot. It's a visualization that shows where she looked during a short amount of time, just a couple of minutes. And there are a lot of reasons why this design isn't working, but in this case, a flat UI doesn't help. It doesn't help her sort out where she's supposed to look on this page. And so another example here, this is Teavana, a tea seller e-commerce site. It's also very flat, but it's also very simple, and it has a low information density. So when a user arrived on this site and they were trying to choose a gift for a friend, he was pretty quickly able to look at the available navigation choices and fixate on the menu option that said gift. So users have less trouble with traditional, simple UIs like these when they're also flat. And additionally, the site does a good job of paying attention to context. Things are located where users would expect them to be. But notice that this one is not completely flat. There is a little bit of a shadow under that sticky navigation at the top that makes it appear raised. And so that leads me to my next recommendation. Don't think it's a binary choice. Remember, it's not just flat or not. You can add a little bit of depth into your flat designs and give people these clickability clues, help them understand and create a sense of a little bit of depth. But then again, we're not going all the way back to the heavy-handed skeuomorphic effects. So we don't want to overreact. We want to have a nice, happy medium between these options. And so Google's material design language is a good example of flat-ish, or flat 2.0 if you want to call it. So these are just some examples of material design in its mobile apps. And material design has its own fair share of issues. But those shadows, for example, those shadows aren't always used in really meaningful ways, which is problematic. But I do like that they try to define these different layers. They try to add in a little bit of that depth while still retaining the aesthetics of flat design. And then finally, the best way to make sure that your users understand your interface is, as always, to test with them. Even if you're not the one doing these tests, make sure that someone in your organization is. You really need to make sure that people are able to complete the tasks that they want to be doing with your product, and also make sure that they're reacting to the visual design that you've chosen as you expect them to. One thing to be aware of here is that flat design is one of those things that will vary depending on your audience. So for example, we found in our research that young adults tend to respond slightly more positively to flat designs than older adults do. And we've also found that they tend to be a little bit better at figuring out how these work, even when they're very challenging. So definitely you want to test this with your specific population that you're interested in. So if you just zoned out for 35 minutes, that's okay. If you take nothing else from this talk, I really hope that you will remember these 3 points. Flat design is great when it's done right. Flat design is not the enemy. Weak signifiers and absent signifiers are the enemy. We want to make sure that we're telling people what they can do, letting them know what actions are available in this interface. And then finally, some related articles. So I have been looking into flat design for a long time. I'm always writing articles about the findings that I get. So if you want more detail about any of the studies that I covered today, you can find them at these links. I think these slides will be posted online. If you want to look at this right now and you don't want to wait for the slides, you could also go to our website, nngroup.com, and just search flat design, and all of these will come up. Thanks.